Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Thank you so much for being part of the program this week. We have a great lineup for you, and we jump right in. First and foremost, we'll remind you, you can find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org and keep track of all of our podcasts and previous episodes on our YouTube channel under Freedom and Prosperity Radio. J. Christian Adams is the president and general counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, and he is the guy that, while you're trying to make ends meet or trying to figure out what social distancing is out there unearthing every little rock and hidden agenda in the mossy-covered fields of politics, and he has found just piles of money in a country with such a big hit on its GDP. You'd think that the left wouldn't have so much money to contribute to campaigns, but apparently not the case. You can find out more at publicinterestlegal.org, but he's on the program with us. Chris, good morning and welcome back to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. So how much have you found first? And we'll get into where is it all coming from. But it seems like every time the conservative movement figures out some new way to raise money, there's like a Vote Red or Act Red kind of going after the online small donor donations. You turn around and you say, aha, we figured out a way to do it. And it was like, oh, yeah, there's tens of billions of dollars flowing into left-wing coffers to swing elections. What have you found?
Well, look, the most important thing to understand is they're not just raising money for campaigns. That's sort of like yesterday's model. They're raising money to build infrastructures to change how the entire system works. And that's far more insidious. For example, in Virginia, they spent untold amounts of money on changing how the election system works in the last General Assembly session. Mm-hmm. They aren't interested in ideas, they're interested in structures.
And that goes to something that we've pointed out frequently is that this isn't so much about ideology as it is authority over, at very most base level, a massive slush fund of taxpayer money.
Well, eventually they turn the levers of government toward their ideological agenda. But as it stands right now, there's hundreds of millions of dollars pouring into the fight on the left to change how the elections are run. Mm-hmm. There's so many groups. They've set up something called a National Task Force on Election Crisis to take advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to justify changes. They have groups. I mean, I could go on, but just a few of these names. Listen to these. The Funders Committee for Civic Participation, the Proteus Fund, the Democracy Fund, Wellspring Philanthropic, Neo Philanthropy, Arabella Advisors. All of these groups exist, which nobody in the real world has ever heard of, to pay for progressive on-the-ground fights to change the election system. And that's why in Virginia, in the last General Assembly, they instituted ranked choice voting as an option for local governments. Now, most people are saying, what in the world is ranked choice voting? But you just wait. You're going to see next time you elect your school board, possibly.
Well, and anyone who's ever been through a convention, whether it be Republican or Democrat, can sit there and say, well, hold it. How did the guy on the second place guy on everyone's ballot win the election? But that's one of the fruits of that, as well as no voter ID anymore, same-day registration of voting, and on top of that, now they want to go to all mail-in, no witness required absentee balloting. Chris, it's stunning, and now you understand why Michael Bloomberg's groups thought it was such a good idea to fund all those Commonwealth's attorney races.
Well, of course, because that changes the structure on another level. That changes how we prosecute the lawless. And, these progressives are not, they're kind of big fans of the lawless. That's how their bread gets buttered. And so, look, guys, 30 years ago in this country, it was a debate about ideas, about policies. Like, is this tax policy better or is that tax policy better? Is this law better or is that law? they're no longer about that. They're about fundamentally transforming the cultural structure of the country, the architecture of the country. They're about changing how we vote, when we vote, who we vote for, whether or not you prosecute certain crimes. It's a totally different ballgame than it was 30 years ago. And I'm not sure that all of the folks in Virginia have totally adapted to this new environment, as evidenced by all the stuff that passed in the General Assembly last session and the almost complete unwillingness to oppose it.
Well, it was an unwillingness not just to oppose it in the General Assembly session, but even at the election, Chris, and that's where I think perhaps unknown to many, the most important or impactful election is coming up when the Republican Party of Virginia chooses the chair, because it was a mail-in. You want to talk about a mail-in election? There were 7 Senate seats were completely uncontested, which allowed not just the Democrat to win, but them to spend the money they raised on other people's races. So, it wasn't even, what's Yoda's expression, there is no try, there is do or no do. Well, in RPV hallways, it seems like there's not even try.
Well, look, I'm not close enough to the fights about RPV, but I can tell you this, that when I see that little or no fight was put into these election law changes, it's only a couple of seats that are in deficit in both chambers. And so there's always ways to fight when you're on a close margin in a still largely sane state. I mean, I know there's Northern Virginia, but there has to be an adaptation away from the gentlemanly Virginia approach toward a much more aggressive pushback, because that's exactly what the progressives from Northern Virginia have started. And it's time to match them at their own game.
Chris, has the demographics changed so much that districts that used to be represented by, noted centrist Republicans like Ken Cuccinelli are no longer even considered, competable anymore?
Well, maybe in Fairfax. I'll tell you something more important that has happened. Districts that used to be held by moderate or traditional Democrats have become radicalized. Mm-hmm. And one need only look at the Alexandria City Council, for example, for this phenomenon. About a decade ago, there was 1 out of 6 was Republican on the Alexandria City Council. They figured out they could eliminate all Republicans by moving the election to the general election date in November instead of the date in May. So they eliminated all Republicans then. And then what happened next was astonishing. It went from pro-business Democrats, moderate-type Democrats, including an African-American, Bill Ewell, to abject nutcase radicals, like progressive activists who have never held a job in their life, are now on the Alexandria City Council. Same thing is happening to Fairfax County School Board, where it used to be, sort of moderate left-center Democrats, and now there are 4 activist progressive radicals on the Fairfax County School Board. So what happens next, and this is important, is that progressive energy, that desire to fight and transform, goes to Richmond and is met with gentlemanly Republicans. And I don't think it's like a tiger getting loose from a cage. People don't know what to do when they face it for the first time. It's like, wow, they'll say and do anything to push this agenda. And I don't think Virginia Republicans have yet adapted to the new environment that exists.
J. Christian Adams is the president and general counsel for the Public Interest Legal Foundation. We're talking about the millions and millions of dollars being poured into changing the 2020 elections and society going forward after that. It is important for me, at least, to point out that all of the things that they promote have been tried before, and the impoverished people that they campaign to, many more of them since the COVID-19 shutdowns, never ever come out better for it. And it is the reason, not because, we like our ties better than their ties. It has to do with the fact that they're lying to you. They tell you you're poor and I'm going to make you not poor. That's not what winds up happening. And it's usually way too late for people to understand. So I just wanted to make that point, Chris, is because people say, oh, you just don't like them politically. I couldn't care less. If a conservative Democrat came back out and said, I believe in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, I don't care which political party. I get no ad buy points for Republicans versus Democrats.
Right, totally. I mean, I'm criticizing Republicans here. I think this is about freedom versus authority. Mm-hmm. This is about liberty versus tyranny. This is about choice. The ability to do what you want every day versus being told what to do.
Mm-hmm. So you've been digging under rocks, finding all this money. You mentioned some of these names, and of course we see Eric Holder out on TV. Is he just a front man for this? Is it like, oh, you're all looking at Eric Holder because he shows up on the Daily Show or whatever, and he's doing his tour of election reform, while these other organizations completely unknown are out there funding all this stuff?
Yeah, Holder is the celebrity radical who made it to the big show while he was Attorney General, and so it normalizes the radicalism. He's the person they could put out there who is a fellow traveler who believes in the crazy, but used to be the Attorney General of the United States, so he's got the imprimatur of somewhat establishment, mm-hmm. And so he's sort of like, hey, look, here's our guy. And so he goes out and can scoop up enormous quantities of money. He talks the talk. He walks the walk. He's a hardcore progressive who also happened to be Attorney General.
Is this funding with besides ideological, I wonder, are these folks that you're finding giving all this money to fundamentally change the way Virginia and the United States operates, is there a profit motive in this, or are these people who've just become so well off, they're just, they've decided that sitting on this money looks impolite, so they just want to change the country because they feel like the little people need something and they don't want them marching on their house with pitchforks?
No, there's no profit. This is look, guys, you need to understand something. This is their way. It's like donating to a church. It's like leaving a legacy to their church. This is they are after a progressive utopia, and they believe in heaven on earth, and that if they simply had progressive policies, that we would live longer, we'd live happier. It'd be a sort of perfect little Eden, and they view this as an absolute donation mm-hmm. to the church, to their church, to changing America, to getting rid of the structural impediments of the Constitution that allow people to own firearms, for example. Mm-hmm. And so this is all about charity to them. This isn't a profit motive.
So it really is that I've done my charitable work. I voted for progressive candidate X, so I don't need to go out and actually work at a soup kitchen.
Well, remember, a lot of this is coming through billion-dollar funding streams. This is not these are not people who are struggling. These are founders of eBay who donate to progressive causes.
Yeah,
these funds that I rattled off at the beginning of the segment are about big dollars. This is big money. This is not small dollar stuff. This is, for example, there's a group in Washington called R Street that is ostensibly claims to be conservative, mm-hmm. but they've received $600,000 in 1 year from the Tides Foundation. They received $500,000 from the Democracy Alliance. They got another $500,000 from the Open Society Institute, which is a George Soros group. That's over $1.5 million from just three hardcore leftist organization funders. And so this is not small dollar stuff. And that's only one group, by the way, 1.5 million. Imagine 500 like them. That's what's happening.
Chris, what happens when, the most notable conservative, that does this is the Koch Foundation. It's certainly gained the most notoriety, good, bad, and indifferent. And just within the first 3 years of the Trump administration, the character assassination and the guilt by association has even broken their will to continue to promote conservative causes because they, for whatever reason, don't want to have themselves associated with the president, or some of them do, some of them don't. If the biggest gun in the conservative arsenal can, turn tail and run, who's left to guard the Alamo?
Look, I can't speak for the Koch Foundation. I think they have blinders on about thinking government is anything that only government can produce bad things. I think they've got some blind spots on about the culture and things like that. But I can't speak for Koch. All I can say is that the left went after Koch in a very, very systematic way, showing up at their meetings. They may have had the big inflatable giant rats, I don't know. But the point is that Koch underwent a transformation because of it. And, I can't speak for it. I think maybe they don't fully appreciate what's happening in the culture, and they think that government, the government doesn't let some salon owner open up, that's the worst possible thing. They don't understand maybe that that's a downstream result of something upstream happening far worse.
What I really think conservatives miss is the amount of money that goes into game day operations, to use a sports parlance, since there are no sports games going on until this weekend. This is, paying for a dozen people to sit out in front of every polling place in an area if they've targeted it, so that when you pull up there, you see the one guy with the conservative flyer and a dozen people under the Democratic banner, and you're like, well, that club is obviously a lot more fun than mine, and they've got pizza and donuts and coffee. It's that soft stuff that really wins, a 1 or 2% vote in an election with very few percentages turning out in the first place.
Right. That game day presence is one. There's a lot more that are subtle like that. The Republicans for a long time didn't pay any attention to. They still look. There's a whole consultant class in Virginia that's dedicated to direct mail radio and TV, and so they're never going to point out that the world has changed. Right. The Japanese still love their battleships in World War II. They thought that was going to, because they were very used to battleships being what wins naval fights, and the carrier eventually replaced that. And right now the left has got a carrier, and they're transforming the game day operation, the voter registration side of things, and they're also changing the rules under which the whole game is played in the General Assembly by changing how elections are run. And so it's a multi-front attack. It's not just the inadequacy of battleships. It's everything. They're changing the sea state, and that's the real problem. Is the multi-pronged, $100 million onslaught. Look, they've got people inside the state election office. It's called Designing for Democracy. It's a ballot design effort that's funded by Open Society Institute, where they've got people designing materials for the state who work for Soros, so Soros money, who are inside state election offices as volunteers. That's how the type of game they're playing now.
Oh, we've caught, I think it was Bloomberg had, attorneys working in the Attorney General's office
right.
On environmental fraud, but the same things are going on in any other agendized place.
Right. I mean, look, what you're referring to is this free effort to loan lawyers to state AGs. And I will tell you, for example, there's litigation that my organization's involved with as an amicus, where the League of Women Voters of Virginia tried to get rid of the witness requirement for absentee ballots.
Yeah.
And I sit there and I listen to the court hearings, okay, because I'm in them. I'm a participant in the case, and I hear the Virginia Attorney General's office consistently acquiescing to everything the plaintiff wants. The enemy, right? You're supposed to fight the plaintiff, not agree with the plaintiff. Right. And the Virginia Attorney General's office is submitting affidavits that are helpful to the plaintiff. I mean, this just happened in the last week in this case involving absentee ballots. And it's utterly astonishing that the lawyers in the Virginia Attorney General's office don't feel an ethical obligation to defend the laws that they were hired and swore an oath to defend.
Is that a subtext? We've talked about this for years, Chris. Is this idea that instead of legislating, they want to litigate? Instead of writing new law and passing it and having it done in front of everybody, they just want rulings. They want attorneys general not prosecuting crimes that they don't think should be crimes, or targeting people for crimes that aren't crimes. But beyond that, even as you mentioned, the administrative state doing things that they have no authority to do. But if nobody says stop, they're going to keep doing it.
Right. It's anti-democratic, and it circumvents the will of the people, and it's something that Eric Holder made very popular when he was Attorney General, and I guess Attorney General Mark Herring in Virginia just picked up the playbook and is now doing it in Richmond. I mean, I will tell you, it's astonishing. It's anti-democratic. I mean, they talk about democracy all the time, but in the end, they're not. They're authoritarian, and they want to be able to tell everybody what the law is, regardless of whether or not it passed. If a law passed in Richmond through the General Assembly and was signed by the governor, no big deal. All we got to do is find the League of Women Voters, and we'll engage in in my opinion, collusive litigation to undermine what the will of the people was just a few months ago.
Oh, without question. That's even after the progressive swing of 2019. So is there hope? Can there, with a Herculean effort, understanding that we're still talking about elections that, especially statewide, 2021, going to maybe see 50% voter turnout statewide and down ticket, who knows? When we're talking about splitting up 40% of the electorate, can the constitutionalists marshal enough people without all this money to get out and win some of these seats back?
Well, the good news is that in large measure the people are still on the side of the Constitution, despite the best efforts of the left to delegitimize our Constitution and our framework. But what it takes to activate that wellspring of support is knowing how to do it. And so far, what I said earlier stands true. You have to land a punch in order to get your side ready to fight with you. You have to do things and say things that mobilize your base. You have to excite the people who agree with you. You have to show a willingness to combat the people who stand against your values. It is no longer a cocktail party in Richmond, and we can't treat it like one.
You mentioned Mark Herring. Let's not forget that it's a couple of hundred votes is the difference between Mark Obenshain, Attorney General, and Mark Herring, Attorney General, and what this kind of money could go. Perhaps he saw it and benefited from it firsthand, Chris. And this is going to be enormous, because I think 2020 is going to be partially COVID driven in the congressional races, and you'll probably hear a lot of people saying, vote for me or that $600 check goes away. And that may work, it may not, but this money has got to be countermanded. And you mentioned consultants in the ones who are driven by mailers and ad buys. I mean, that's where they make their money. Do the progressive consultants make their money a different way than the conservative ones do?
Right, because the progressive consultants, look, there's money on that side. But don't forget, for them, it's evangelical. For them, they're on a mission to transform the world. Okay, they're not mercenary in the same way that the Republican consultants are. And speaking of consultants, heading into next year, we need to know who is in charge of opposition research for Ed Gillespie. Right?
Yes.
We need to know the names of those people to make sure they're not within 1,000 feet of another Republican campaign.
What a whiff on that, and I think I may have met the person who first leaked the yearbook photo, and it's amazing to realize they very well were a Democrat who was just tired of Ralph Northam talking about his military service. But it's amazing that it was out there. It was a yearbook photo, and swing and a miss. And to the dark arts of a guy like Terry McAuliffe creates a race riot in Charlottesville to create a narrative that if you vote for Ed Gillespie, you're voting for white supremacists, when, quite honestly, the 2017 governor's race was really milquetoast versus milquetoast. It was two relatively bland candidates, and yet we saw more votes cast for either of them than any Virginia governor before.
And a great example during that campaign is how Republicans were so outraged at how Gillespie was attacked as a racist and how dare you and all that. And, this will never work. Well, the reality is it did work.
Oh, yeah.
And unless you fight fire with fire, and that's exactly what I'm saying, unless you fight progressive fire with constitutionalist fire, you're going to lose. And you're going to lose the country, and you're going to lose the Constitution while you were trying to be nice. And it doesn't work anymore. And I think Donald Trump is proof positive that sterner measures are needed to fight back this onslaught of the likes of Eric Holder and Bernie Sanders and the people who basically want to push the country overboard. You have to do more than tusk and cast your vote in the General Assembly.
Chris, thank you again so much for what you do. Publicinterestlegal.org is his website. Please, support what they do there, and you can read his stuff online at PJ Media and look at the numbers. Try to have belief that you can go out and evangelize, because we've got to get the people motivated. The numbers just are still in our favor. As Chris, thank you so much for joining us this week. We got to run to a break here, but you have a great week, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Take care.
Coming up next, Robin Walker, Senior Director of Federal Affairs for the Foundation for Government Accountability and Welfare for All. Isn't it in the preamble of the Constitution? We'll be right back with that next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.